It's Tuesday, the 16th of December, 2025, and it's our penultimate show of the year. Today, why is Europe not yet boycotting Israel? But first, here are the top stories of the day. US President Donald Trump has said 59 countries have signaled readiness to participate in a stabilization force in Gaza. This force underpins phase 2 of Trump's so-called ceasefire plan, which he brokered between Israel and Hamas, but it has struggled to get off the ground. Speaking from the Oval Office, Trump claimed the force is already operating without providing specifics. He added more states will join, even as Gaza remains under Israeli bombardment. Israeli soldiers have been pictured lighting Hanukkah candles in occupied territories in Syria, the West Bank and Gaza, sparking criticism on social media. An image circulated of a Hanukkah menorah being lit in Syria's Mount Hermon on Sunday. Israel, which has already illegally occupied Syria's Golan Heights since 1967, expanded its territory in southern Syria following the fall of Bashar al-Assad's government. Read the full stories on MiddleEastEye.net. As 2025 comes to a close, are the curtains also closing on Israel's place on the European cultural stage?
Hey, I'm Nemo, and last year I won Eurovision, and with it, this trophy. Today I no longer feel like this trophy belongs on my shelf. Eurovision says it stands for unity, for inclusion, and dignity for all people. But Israel's continued participation during what the UN's Independent International Commission of Inquiry has concluded to be a genocide shows there's a clear conflict between those ideals and the decisions the EBU is making. I'm sending this trophy back to the EBU headquarters in Geneva.
I informed the board that we, the executive management, had already made the decision yesterday not to take part in Eurovision next year.
Eurovision á næsta ári. Einfaldlega út af því að það engin.
Simply because there is neither peace nor joy surrounding this competition as things currently stand. And on that basis, we are stepping back while the situation is as it is.
Okkur í hlé meðan að.
I was yours and you were mine, but that was once upon a time.
Hello, I'm Charlie McGettigan. People may remember that Paul Harrington and myself won the Eurovision Song Contest way back in 1994. I therefore, in support of Nemo, would like to return my trophy to the EBU as well.
Quiero mostrar todo mi apoyo a esta decisión. Tengo que lamentar que Eurovisión permita el blanqueamiento de un genocidio en curso como se está produciendo en Palestina al aceptar la participación de Israel. Yo creo que el boicot cultural y deportivo a un Estado que practica un genocidio es imprescindible. Lo he dicho muchas veces.
Let's jump back a few months to May 2025. In Gaza, famine is soon to be declared after 10 weeks of a total aid blockade imposed by Israel on the Strip. 1 in 5 babies is now born preterm or underweight, and nearly 17,000 pregnant women need urgent malnutrition treatment. Meanwhile, at the St. Jakobshalle Arena in Switzerland, Israel is ploughing to second place in the Eurovision Song Contest. In response to their victory, several countries flagged suspicions that Israel's government had manipulated the vote through an orchestrated PR campaign. Viewers also accused Eurovision of censoring audience booing during Israel's semi-final performance, which it denies. These controversies came amid mounting pressure on the European Broadcasting Union, which organises the contest, to review Israel's participation amid its genocide in Gaza. The EBU decided to maintain Israel's participation, though it did change the voting rules that had been called into question. Their response insisted on the neutrality of the contest. While Israel has competed in Eurovision since 1973, Palestine's bid to join was rejected in 2007 on the grounds its broadcaster didn't meet EBU eligibility requirements. Palestinian culture, meanwhile, has been systematically targeted in Israel's ongoing war, according to the UN. Airstrikes have pummeled heritage sites, community centres and sports facilities, while attacks on civilian infrastructure has repeatedly plunged the media into blackout. Israel's near victory at Eurovision 2025 reflects the inconsistency of the global response to this warfare. At the time of the contest, European leaders had broadly condemned Israel's aid blockade while maintaining trade and military supplies with the nation. On the 29th of September, Donald Trump announced that he had brokered a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. He reportedly pressured Israeli compliance by warning the country was losing in the world of public relations. While Trump's ceasefire has neither ended Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine nor its army's massacre of hundreds of civilians, it has settled political attacks by key allies that were leaving Israel isolated. But in the cultural sphere, Israel is facing mounting pressures. When Israel was cleared to enter the 2026 Eurovision Song Contest earlier this month, the competition was plunged into one of the biggest rows in its history. Spain, Ireland, Slovenia, the Netherlands, and Iceland have pulled out in protest, and 2 former winners have handed back their trophies. Israel accuses its critics of mounting a global smear campaign against it. But it's not just Eurovision. In the world of sports, a vote has just been scheduled today that could set in motion Israel's exclusion from European football. More on that later. Today we ask, will culture do what politics did not and end Israel's impunity on the world stage? I'm joined first by international human rights lawyer and former New York director of the UN's Human Rights Office, Craig Mokhiber. Craig, welcome to MEE Live. The 2026 Eurovision Song Contest, it's now 5 countries down. How many countries do you think could join this boycott, and where would that leave Eurovision?
Well, I think that we are seeing a trend that is growing. I mean, Eurovision so far has refused to ban Israeli participation, which is quite remarkable, despite the boycott of Spain and Ireland and Slovenia and Iceland and the Netherlands. And then you add to that the fact that several winners have returned their prize in protest, that many artists scheduled to participate this year have withdrawn in protest from the contest, from the contest, even where their countries are still listed to participate. And I think you have to ask yourself, should Israel be allowed to participate in Eurovision or other cultural events, even as the regime attacks every cultural institution in occupied Palestine and detains and murders Palestine's cultural icons? I think the answer is very clear.
Obviously, the EBU disagrees and is maintaining Israeli participation. You see the insides of these campaigns, and maybe can shed a bit of light on how they work. Why is it that Israel hasn't yet been banned?
Well, Israel enjoys an unprecedented level of impunity. Impunity that has been buttressed by powerful Western countries for decades, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and others, and reinforced as well by Western media corporations that black out Israeli atrocities and try to contribute to this ongoing process of normalization, really. And we know that boycotts like this are powerful moral actions that can help to halt the complicity that builds the impunity of the Israeli state. So you can think of the English boycott of sugar produced by slaves in the 1790s, or the anti-Nazi boycotts of the 1930s across the West, or the Indian boycott of British goods organized by Gandhi, or here in the US, the Montgomery bus boycott in the segregated south of the US, the farm workers boycott of grapes and lettuce in the 1980s that I participated in, and of course the anti-apartheid boycott against apartheid South Africa. Every one of these drew a moral line in the sand and helped to injustice and ultimately to end injustice and ultimately to change history, even though the perpetrators of those crimes continued to resist and continued to have the complicit support of powerful Western governments. This is a way for the people to contribute to changing history. And we know the people are standing with Palestine in this genocide. And I think, all of these examples in history tell us we have a duty to follow in their footsteps. We have a duty to demand that Israeli oppression not be accepted, not be normalized, and then to hold the line in solidarity with the struggling Palestinian people until justice comes. And I think we are seeing a trend in that direction. I hope it will continue to build.
You mentioned that the power of the counter boycott, so to speak. Germany, I think it's worth Worth mentioning, Germany, which is a major Eurovision backer, has signalled that it would not participate if Israel was banned. Of course, another factor that is often used to undermine these boycott campaigns when it comes to Israel is the accusation of anti-Semitism. Here's the response of Israeli former Eurovision Song Contest contestant Noah Kirill to the growing boycott movement.
Decision because the Eurovision is a bridge, is not a wall, and the heart of this competition is connecting hearts through music. And unfortunately, some countries are letting politics, ruin the celebration. Israel did not violate any rules of the Eurovision. Israel is a peace-seeking country, and on October 7th, Israel did not attack anyone. Israel was brutally attacked in a way unseen before. Entire families were murdered, including children, civilians were kidnapped. Israel defended itself like any other nation would do. Those countries are choosing to see the opposite, to ignore the reality, and to boycott Israel. That is anti-Semitism. Boycotting Israel on political grounds, it's not just an injury to us, it's an injury to everything that...
I mean, there's a lot in that clip to unpack. It's clearly absurd to describe Israel as a peaceful state at this, point in time. But I am curious what you would say to claims that cultural boycotts of Israel are just anti-Semitism.
Well, I don't think those sort of classic Israeli talking points are holding much water anymore. There was a time when they would intimidate critics, human rights defenders and others, but that isn't working anymore because effectively everyone who's been involved in the defense of human rights has been accused of being an anti-Semite at this moment by Israel and its proxies in the West. We see the reality on the ground, which is why this kind of propaganda doesn't work anymore. This genocide in Palestine that is ongoing as we speak has registered a lot of dark firsts. It is, as everyone says, the first live-streamed genocide, which very much affects public opinion. It was also the first high-tech genocide using advanced weaponry and surveillance machinery to exterminate a people. But I think most importantly for our discussion today, it's also the first globalized genocide. You have complicit actors in both the public and private sectors across the globe, especially across the West, who are actually supporting the genocide. And look, what we're talking about here, that speaker can claim whatever distracting techniques she wishes, but we're talking about an oppressive apartheid regime that, as we speak, is carrying out mass murder, systematic torture, sexual assault, wholesale destruction of civilian life in Palestine, that's been carrying out serial aggression and assassinations all across the region, that carried out a transnational terror attack with booby-trapped pagers in Lebanon and in Syria, that's occupying the territory of 3 surrounding nations. And I think to normalize such a regime would be a moral abomination. And I think that, the fact that so many Jewish people around the world are participating in these boycotts, are condemning the Israeli regime, are standing up for the human rights of the Palestinian people, reveals the lie of that old trick of accusing everyone of being an anti-Semite. More and more people in the world have recognized that this regime is a moral abomination, that normalizing its conduct is a very immoral act. And yet that is exactly what FIFA and UEFA and Eurovision and so many other complicit entities are doing by allowing the continued participation of the Israeli regime, even while in real time it's practicing unlawful occupation and apartheid and genocide and the gross and systematic violation of human rights of the indigenous people of Palestine. People of conscience are saying this cannot go on unchallenged. Not in UEFA, not in FIFA.
Are they still saying that? Because no, I understand we have seen immense global pressure from civil society, them saying no to this genocide. And a few months ago, it felt as though many people were asking, whether Israel's state could meet the same fate as the South African apartheid, which, as you rightly pointed out, was in large part toppled due to global boycott movements and grassroots opposition. But since then, a ceasefire was brokered by the US, and Donald Trump literally, reportedly persuaded Netanyahu to agree to this ceasefire by warning him that this was the only way to save Israel's deteriorating reputation, right? The president has said on several occasions, Israel may be winning the war in Gaza, but it's losing the PR war internationally. And that is not wrong. I wonder whether this ceasefire and the advice of Donald Trump successfully dampened popular momentum for Palestinian justice. What would you say?
There's no question that they have had a propaganda coup with this so-called ceasefire. But let's remember there is no ceasefire. There hasn't been a ceasefire for a single day. Israel has murdered hundreds of Palestinians during the so-called ceasefire. It has continued also to launch attacks against Palestinian fighters and to murder Palestinian civilians. It has blocked thousands of truckloads of urgently needed food and medicine and shelter for Palestinian survivors of the genocide. And it has continued to destroy civilian infrastructure. So there hasn't been a single day of ceasefire. The only side that is ceasefiring has been the Palestinian resistance. And that reality is beginning to break through the wall of propaganda built by the fake ceasefire brokered by Donald Trump, or the fake peace process that has zero hope of bringing anything other than further oppression and further conflict. And so at a moment like this in history, when you see, for example, football associations allowing teams from the Israeli regime to participate, even as the Israeli regime abducts and detains and tortures and murders Palestinian footballers and has systematically destroyed Palestinian sports facilities, and then sends mobs of deeply racist and violent Israeli hooligans to chant genocidal slogans, to terrorize local communities, to attack opposing fans. That's what the people are seeing. It's hard to imagine anything more obscene than allowing the Israeli regime to be represented in international sporting or international cultural events in that context. And that's why both fans and members of UEFA support Israel's expulsion, even now with this temporary propaganda coup of the so-called ceasefire. And that's why the movement for removing Israel from Eurovision is also growing despite this fake ceasefire propaganda effort. So no, I don't think that's going to work in holding back the flood of moral outrage at what Israel is, what Israel does, and the offense that people take in efforts to normalize the regime, even as it perpetrates these crimes.
And that takes us nicely onto our next topic. So Craig Mokhiber, thank you so much for joining MEE Live.
Thank you for having me.
We turn now to the world of sports. On the 17th of September, one day after the UN declared Israel's actions in Gaza a genocide, the Game Over Israel campaign was launched to persuade UEFA to ban Israel from the European Football League. In the weeks that followed, the New York Times reported that UEFA had decided to call a vote over Israel's ongoing participation. But then it stepped back after Trump's ceasefire was brokered between Israel and Hamas. Since then, it looks from the outside like momentum has fallen, but behind the scenes, wheels are turning, and organisers tell us Israel's football ban may be closer to reality than ever. Joining us now for the inside story is Ashish Prashar, former advisor to the Middle East peace envoy and campaign director for Game Over Israel. Ashish, welcome. You appeared to be making strides in September, meeting with UEFA executives over a possible Israeli suspension. But since this so-called ceasefire, UEFA has called off the vote so as not to be a barrier to peace efforts. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, look, I mean, we launched with a bang. I mean, you remember the iconic billboard in Times Square that literally called out Israel's genocide the same day the report came out, as you mentioned, and then demanding football acts. And people always ask us, like, why didn't you go after like a Starmer or a Trump or people like that with that billboard? We went for football because we knew that culture and the isolation in culture has crippled many regimes before. And it also created global momentum around pushing the federations of Europe, who already acted like this against Russia, right? There's federations, 12 of them gathered together and said, we don't want Russia in football. And then 2 days later, UEFA and FIFA acted. And we had to apply that same pressure. And they were that close. On the 30th, President Sefrin, who's the head of UEFA, was going to call the vote. You know, as you mentioned, the ceasefire had like put him on pause, where he basically said, I don't want to interfere in this peace process that could develop. Fine. We didn't stop, right? Some of the advisors, as you have noted in our campaign and our team, include Craig Mokhiber and Richard Falk and people like that. And we had this back channel open with UEFA that we continued to pursue through this process. We then submitted letters by former ICJ judges and set up meetings with other foreign policy experts from the United Nations and everything else, with not just UEFA leadership, but those federation leaders from each country, countries that you've already mentioned are boycotting Israel through other tournaments like Eurovision, right? We set up this environment where people were being educated on not just why Israel should be, why we should have held Israel accountable before the ceasefire, but also like, we've done this before. A great example that we use often is post-World War II, Did you not all agree that we should have suspended Germany from international sport and other cultural institutions? Nobody said no. No football federation leader from Italy to Turkey to Sweden said no. They were like, yes, that was the right decision. Closer to home, Yugoslavia in Europe, right? When the Balkan Wars were going on, we suspended several nations for human rights violations and atrocities they had committed. And they did not come back into football for whether it be a year or 6 months or other cultural events. Again, we've done this before. And we hold people accountable, not just while they're committing a genocide. By the way, because this is the first live stream genocide, it would have been the first time we did it while the genocide happens. But we also, in history, always hold them accountable after they've committed this atrocity. So even if bullets and bombs stop, even if they stop, and they haven't, as you mentioned before, if they did, you still have to hold those perpetrators accountable.
So I just want to catch up with where the campaign is now, because while there was at one point a vote on the table by UEFA executives, that seems to now not be on the table, and you have had to turn to other avenues. Now, it's just been announced today that on the 13th of January, Switzerland will vote on whether to end UEFA's special tax exemption in the country. Tell us, what has this tax vote got to do with Israel?
Well, so like in the build-up to what I was getting to was basically that all our officials will be meeting with representatives in different countries as well. And we met with UEFA officials who pointed us to some of the pressure points that they are facing. Internally, there was an ICJ ruling in September 2024 that basically said Israel has to leave the occupied territories. It's in violation of Palestinian land. That includes their football teams that sit in the occupied West Bank. There is 5 or 6 football teams that play under the Israeli Football League, but also under the UEFA banner in illegal territory. UEFA are in breach of that, right? And using that, we understand that UEFA gets a tax break from the Swiss government based on the fact that they promote peace. How fun that if you promote peace, you don't pay tax in Switzerland. And what we've actually managed to do is bring attention to Swiss parliamentarians that now UEFA is hosting the Israeli Football League under the UEFA banner, but it is in violation of an ICJ ruling. See, the Swiss take that stuff seriously, maybe unlike the UK government and its threats to the ICC and the US, who don't take any international law seriously, but the Swiss do take that seriously. And that's a government that has actually tried to create almost like terms and conditions of how to work with international law before in history, right? So they have taken that ruling by the ICJ that ended, by the way, that leeway period for Israel ended in September 2025. So now everyone who is complicit or works with or operates with Israel in the occupied territories is in breach of that ruling.
Right, so let me get this straight. If Switzerland votes to revoke UEFA's special tax status because it is no longer an agent of peace under the ICJ ruling, UEFA will have to choose between banning Israel and paying loads and loads of tax in Switzerland. Is that right?
Yeah. So first of all, there's a local vote in the Canton Vaud, which is there like effectively like London inside Switzerland, and then there's a federal vote right after that, right? A week later. And if both votes pass, UEFA would have to decide whether they pay a multi-million dollar, hundreds of millions of dollar tax back to Switzerland for now being in violation of the international law. Also, other threats could be held there, right? So you've got this issue then, like, if you're in violation of international law, should you exist as an entity? Should there not be other charges brought to you under Swiss law because you are in breach of this ruling? But step that aside, they either pay the bill or they suspend Israel. Now, in what we believe is going to happen is if the first vote is won at the local level, between that and the federal vote, we believe that UEFA might call their own vote at that point and say, look, we're going to vote on whether Israel should participate. And we already know that we have enough votes at the UEFA Executive Committee. We know it would be an overwhelming majority, 15, 16 odd votes out of the 19, that would vote to suspend Israel tomorrow. And I believe if a vote is called by President Sefrin, who's the only barrier to a vote right now, people are going to be asking, do we want to pay a hefty tax bill to the Swiss government? Do we want to exist as an entity? Or do we want to continue to protect Israel, maybe end ourselves in Swiss territory?
So you're saying that by the end of January, essentially, you're saying pretty confidently that we could see a UEFA ban on Israel. And then what? What follows that? Do you think?
There'll be heavy lobbying to the Swiss parliamentarians. You and me both know that UEFA is going to do everything to say, look, we are a proud company, organization, entity within Switzerland. They're going to do everything they can to stave off the vote and try and win it, of course. But if they lose it, Israel could be eventually out of football in January.
You say out of football, will UEFA have to set a precedent? Do you think that Israel will be playing in next year's World Cup?
Well, look, they didn't qualify for the World Cup, so that's not they won't participate. But the next tournament after that is the European Nations League in September.
Mm-hmm.
There is a draw for that Nations League. You're going to love this in the beginning of February this year coming up. Israel is in a pot where they could be drawn against countries that you've already mentioned in the Eurovision: the Republic of Ireland, Slovenia, Bosnia, Macedonia, Sweden, and many other countries that, well, let's just say have not been friendly, including the Swiss, by the way. They could be drawn against any of these nations. Most of them have already taken positions against the Israeli regime in Eurovision and politically as well. And take Slovenia's case. This is one of the most interesting things that people do not, in England and the UK and the US, do not talk enough about, especially as it relates to a cultural boycott. The president of UEFA is from Slovenia. Slovenia has the only official arms embargo against Israel. Slovenia's Attorney General happens to be the brother of the president of UEFA. He's the only one with arrest warrants out for the perpetrators of this genocide in Netanyahu and Gallant that are not just the ICC arrest warrants. Slovenia will be lobbying hard not to play Israel, to put their own country at jeopardy, and they would not want to host those games because they will have to act on those very things that they've promised, and they promised their community. Is the president of Slovenia going to go head-to-head with the president of UEFA, who is from that country, on this issue? Now, President Sefrin could avoid all of this by simply calling a vote at UEFA to suspend Israel, because why would he put any of these countries through this? Now, at this point, right, it's not even about just the genocide. None of these countries, you've seen yourself, want to host Israel in any way. They don't want to deal with the political fallout of these things, because obviously the majority of our populations in Europe are on side at this point. The majority, even in Germany, which has faced massive repression of its population, they, in a country like that, were going to sign an Israeli football player to a German club, and the fans protested and they had to unsign the player. Think about that. In a country with that repression, you're seeing that happen already. They don't want to hold that. And the second thing, the security. You and me both know right now, watching the Maccabi Tel Aviv stuff that happened in the UK, but also looking at what the German police had to provide to escort the Maccabi players to the stadium. It was a convoy that a president would be in awe of. The millions that have been spent to protect Israeli footballers and their fans, who've committed a genocide, who've supported a genocide, nobody wants to even foot the bill. So there's many reasons. None of these countries want to engage with that. And President Sefrin is forcing these countries to engage with that right now. And we don't want to risk their attacks. We don't want to threaten UEFA. We don't want to take them to court over these issues. But this is the only strategic way we know we will deliver a win before the inevitability of a public campaign in those countries that will have to face Israel in the fall.
Ashish Prashar, thank you so much for joining us here on MEE Live. Me betraying my lack of football expertise there. Now for today, that is all that we have time for. But before we lose you, we would love to hear from you. Please send in your thoughts and questions to @MiddleEastEye on any social platform, or email meelive@middleeasteye.net. We'll be here at 5 p.m. GMT, noon in New York, every Tuesday and Thursday. See you then.